She was left alone in the middle of the cotton rows to be forgotten, but that child's cry insisted on piercing through the entire night until it found the ears of a landowner. Can you imagine the despair of a life that begins like that? Tossed aside as if it were worth nothing, dependent entirely on whoever by chance decided to listen to a wailing in the dark of the brush. This story actually happened in the rolling hills and plantations of the Deep South, and what began on that March dawn in 1891 continued to mark destinies until early April 1923, when a weary woman, 3 children, and a handcart made their way down a dirt road toward an old, dilapidated mill that nobody wanted. Before we continue this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and smash the like down below, because the ending of this narrative is going to show you how even the most forgotten life can rise up against injustice. What this woman discovered in that place changed not only her destiny, but that of an entire community. And let me know in the comments which city or state you're watching from. It's always moving to see how far these stories from our heartland can travel. It was late afternoon, April 5th, 1923, and the heat was thick, clinging to the skin like a wet rag. The red clay road rose and dipped, following the contour of the hills, scattered with loose stones that made the wheels of the handcart jump and creak. With every jolt, the few belongings of an entire family rattled: a scratched cast-iron skillet, a dented aluminum basin, 2 thin folded mattresses, a worn blanket, and a crate holding half a dozen articles of clothing. Leading the handcart was Mary Dolores Fields, thin, skin bronzed by the sun, a navy blue kerchief holding her hair back in a tight bun. Her brown cotton dress clung to her body with sweat, and her bare feet kicked up a fine red dust with every step. Her face was that of someone who had long forgotten what rest felt like, but her dark brown eyes still held a remnant of firmness that neither widowhood, hunger, nor humiliation had managed to extinguish. Behind her, pushing against the side of the cart with 2 small hands to help balance the weight, came Anne, her eldest daughter, 15 years old, quiet and watchful. Her long hair, tied in a simple ponytail, had strands stuck to her forehead from the sweat. Anne looked at everything: the hills, the barbed wire fences, the cotton drying yards down below, the sky that threatened a rain that never fell. A little further ahead ran Jackie, 11 years old, scrawny, wearing short trousers patched at the knees and a white shirt that had turned yellow from overuse. He was kicking pebbles and making a small wooden car he'd carved himself with a pocket knife zoom up and down the little earthen banks alongside the road. Every now and then he'd run back to his mother, ask a quick question, receive a short answer, and dart away again. In Mary's arms, resting against her chest, was Tess, 7 years old, wearing a flowered dress that had passed through 2 older cousins before reaching her. Tess hugged her mother's neck tightly, as if afraid that if she let go even a little, she might be left behind on the road. Her curious eyes tried to see over Mary's shoulder at what lay ahead, but exhaustion sometimes made her eyelids heavy. The air smelled of hot earth, dry leaves, and the dust kicked up by the sparse traffic on the road. Down below, in a wide basin, the cotton fields spread out in almost perfect lines, forming a dark green carpet that vanished into the dense woods further back. Somewhere, invisible from there, ran a stubborn trickle of water, a creek that had been fuller in other times, but was now suffering from a drought that seemed to have no end. As she walked, Mary felt the weight not just of the handcart, but of the last few years on her back. In her mind, memories came flooding out as if someone had opened a trunk kept locked for a long time. She remembered the small wattle and daub cabin where she had lived with her husband, Joseph Joe Fields, on the edge of the Brandon estate. She remembered the small yard, the modest vegetable patch, the coop with half a dozen chickens and a proud rooster that woke the world before the sun. It was little, but it was a little they called their own, even knowing that on paper everything still belonged to the colonel. Joe had been a sharecropper almost his whole life. He woke before daybreak, drank black coffee with a piece of stale cornbread, pulled on his worn boots, and went to the fields to tend the furrows, chop weeds, and check the buds. At harvest time, his hands came home stained and smelling of the crop, a mix of sweet and bitter that Mary came to associate with the idea of a future. They would tell each other on moonlit nights that one day they would save enough money to buy a tiny piece of land just for themselves, even if it was just a scrubby hollow with thin grass. But the world doesn't always respect the plans of simple folks. One night of heavy rain, almost a year before that trek down the dirt road, Joe had gone out with the mule wagon loaded with sacks for Mr. Amos's general store in town. The sky was tearing apart with lightning, the smell of wet earth rising strong, and the rumble of thunder mixing with the crack of wooden wheels rolling over potholes. Mary remembered that night as if she were still inside it. She remembered the long wait, the sound of rain on the old tiled roof, every leak forcing a new bucket into the narrow house. She remembered the children huddled on the mattresses, the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, making the kerosene lamp tremble. Joe had said he'd be back before midnight, but dawn came. The rooster crowed, the rain tapered off, and the sound of the wagon never appeared. Who arrived the next morning was their neighbor Angelo, also a sharecropper, hat in hand and face drawn. He told them, his words swallowing part of the scene, that the wagon had skidded on a slope near a ravine and overturned. He didn't go into details, didn't speak of blood or broken bones. He said only that Joe hadn't made it, that the body had been taken straight to the small chapel in the village, and that the priest was already preparing the service. That day, Mary felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. The crop they had worked so hard to harvest turned into a loss noted in Mr. Amos's ledger, now in bolder letters. The little clay house, the small yard, the garden. Everything suddenly seemed fragile, as if a stronger wind could blow it all away. And in a way, it did. Months of mourning passed, of even heavier work, of sleepless nights fearing hunger. Mary doubled her efforts between the fields, taking in laundry for others and caring for the children. Anne helped where she could, looking after Tess, fetching water from the creek, carrying bundles of firewood too small for an adult but too large for her thin arms. Jackie tried to be a man before his time, innocently repeating his father's gestures, gripping a hoe that nearly dragged on the ground. But for the colonel, a poor person's grief has a short expiration date. On a dry August morning, Mary was summoned to the big house of the Brandon estate. She climbed the stairs with her heart racing, feeling the contrast between the smooth stone steps and the packed dirt floor she knew so well. Up there, on the wide veranda, sitting in a rocking chair, was Colonel Jackson Brandon III, a middle-aged man with a discreet paunch hidden under a linen vest, a well-trimmed moustache, and a light-coloured wide-brimmed hat resting on the arm of the chair. He received her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said he lamented what had happened, but that he needed to think about the estate's operations. He explained, in carefully chosen words, that the cabin where she lived would be used by a new tenant farmer with more hands for the hoe, a man with 3 grown sons capable of pulling carts and clearing brush. He said it wasn't fair for her, a lone woman with small children, to occupy a place that could yield more for the harvest. Mary listened to it all, with her head held high, her sweaty hands clutching the hem of her dress. Inside, she felt a mix of anger, humiliation, and fear. She tried to argue that she had nowhere to go, that the children couldn't bear sleeping in the open, that she could work double to compensate. The colonel, with the calculated patience of someone used to giving orders, replied that he didn't run an orphanage or a charity house, but that he wasn't a cruel man. That was when he offered the old mill. He spoke of the dark wooden structure in the basin, near the oldest part of the fields, a place that, according to him, had been abandoned and unused for a long time. He said she could go there with the children, that it would be better than the road, that at least she'd have a roof and a plank floor. He didn't mention at any moment the legend that ran through the region. He didn't speak of the crying in the night, nor the old whispers. He merely said that if she didn't accept, it would be difficult to help her in any other way. Mary left the veranda with shaky legs. She descended the steps, feeling the sun burn her face, but a chill rising up her spine. In her head, the word mill spun along with loose memories. She recalled that when she was still a girl, she'd heard conversations cut in half about that basin, about a place where no one wanted to live. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention. Now, with 3 children and the threat of the road knocking at her door, any corner with a roof took on a different meaning. Before heading to the mill, she decided to stop by the roadside at Ms. Hattie's place. The old woman lived in a small wattle and daub shack with a low roof, a tiny yard with some scrawny chickens, and a guava tree that insisted on bearing fruit even in bad weather. Ms. Hattie had always been a sort of ancient voice of the region, keeping stories that the new folks didn't even remember. When Mary recounted, eyes cast down, that the colonel had ordered her out of the cabin and that she was now going to the old mill in the basin, Miss Hattie held her breath for a moment. Then she crossed herself slowly. Her gaze darted to the dirt floor, then to the window, as if she needed to confirm no one else was listening. She asked if Mary had never heard of the crying in the field. The widow replied she only remembered some old folks talking about ghosts in the night, but had never paid it any mind. Miss Hattie then began to tell the story in a low voice, like someone walking barefoot in an unknown place. She said that on a cold dawn, in March of 1891, when she was still a young woman, she woke up to a strange noise coming from the direction of the fields in the basin. A child's cry, thin and insistent, cutting through the wind and the silence of the night. It wasn't the cry of a fussy boy with colic. It was a cry of despair, of someone left without a lap, without a blanket, without anything. Neighbors said they heard it too. Some were afraid to leave their homes, thinking it might be a lost soul. Others, braver, approached the fence. But the darkness of the dawn, combined with the low mist, hid almost everything. The crying continued for hours, until near daybreak it grew weaker, more spaced out, until it vanished. Days later, whispers began that a landowner of the time, Alphonse Brandon, the current colonel's grandfather, had been seen carrying a bundle in his arms in the dead of night, passing through the rows toward the basin, alone, without a foreman, without an entourage. No one had the courage to ask. In those times, questioning a colonel's actions was asking to disappear. What spread was a legend, not a confirmed truth. Miss Hattie recounted that for many years, folks swore they heard, on certain windy nights, a distant crying coming from that direction, mixed with the rustling of the leaves. Some said it was just the sound of the wind playing in the trees. Others, that it was a child's soul asking to be held. Just in case, people began to avoid that basin, especially after the old mill stopped working and sat there, stalled like a rotten tooth in the mouth of a land that had once been full of shine. Mary listened to this with a knot in her stomach. The idea of taking her children to live in that very place, surrounded by this story, seemed terrible. But what was the alternative? The road, the open air, the humiliation of begging for shelter on someone else's porch and hearing the same embarrassed no. She thanked Miss Hattie, gripping the old woman's wrinkled hand tightly, like someone holding onto a root to keep from sliding down a bank. Now, as the sun went down slowly behind the hills and stretched the shadows across the road, she was approaching the so-called mill. From where she stood, she could see, down below, the dark structure near the edge of the fields. The boards looked blackened by time, the curved tile roof crooked in places, as if it had sunk under the weight of the years. Around it, the weeds grew taller, as if the earth wanted to swallow what man had once built. When they reached the packed dirt yard in front of the mill, the silence seemed heavier. There was no buzz of people, no metallic sound of machines, no fresh smell of the harvest being processed. What existed was a smell of stagnant things, mold, ancient dust, damp wood, remnants of torn burlap sacks. Mary set the handcart down slowly, feeling her arms tremble. Anne stood beside her, her large eyes scanning every detail. Jackie, despite a certain fear he tried to hide, took a few steps forward, curious to explore. Tess snuggled even closer into her mother's arms, adjusting her face on her shoulder and asking in an insecure whisper if this was really the new house. Mary replied that it was, that it would be for now, until God showed a better path. Pushing the front door of the mill was like waking a sleeping beast. The wood groaned loudly, the sound echoing inside. A strong, musty smell invaded their noses. Their eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the gloom. Light entered through cracks in the roof and through some ill-fitted boards in the walls, drawing beams of clarity that cut through the dust suspended in the air. The floor was made of wide, dark planks, stained by time and marked by the dragging of old, heavy sacks. In some spots, the floorboards gave way slightly under their weight, emitting cracks that sounded like old bones. There was still the skeleton of a large gear leaning against a wall, iron reddened by rust, broken belts hanging like dead snakes. In the corner, piles of torn burlap sacks formed nests for rats and insects. Mary took a deep breath and began, mentally, to divide the space. A corner for the beds, another to store their few objects, a drier spot to set up a brazier until she could build a better stove outside. She asked Anne to grab the makeshift broom tied to the handcart and began to sweep, kicking up small clouds of dust that made everyone cough. Jackie went to a window, pushed the wood covering it, and let in more light. The first night at the mill was a mixture of exhaustion and jump scares. They improvised beds in the corner that seemed less damp, laid the thin mattresses over the floorboards, and spared a blanket for the children. Outside, the wind of the dawn passed through the fields, producing a constant sound, a rustling that, because it was so continuous, sometimes sounded like heavy breathing. Lying in the dark, with the lamp already out to save kerosene, everyone heard more than they saw. A crack of wood here, a gust of wind hitting some forgotten sheet of zinc there, a rat scurrying between old sacks, a persistent cricket repeating the same sound outside. Occasionally, a louder noise made Tess shrink, and Mary would press her daughter against her chest, murmuring that it was just the mill settling its bones, like old folks do when they change position in bed. Despite attempts to reassure her children, Mary's heart beat fast. Somewhere in her memory, the story told by Miss Hattie echoed, a child's cry in the night, wind carrying sound from afar, people saying they heard it, people saying it was nothing. She tried to push it from her mind, telling herself that old folks' legends serve more to scare boys than to explain the world. But when the silence of the night grew deeper, it was hard not to imagine that, amidst the rustling leaves, there might be another hidden sound. The following days were of hard labor. Mary cleaned as much as she could, dragging out torn sacks, sweeping away dead bats, clearing spiderwebs with the end of a hoe handle. She set up a brick brazier near a window so the wind would help carry the smoke out. Outside, she marked off a small space with stones for a garden, and began to dream of a few collard greens, some cassava stems, a few rows of beans. Anne helped silently, always watching her mother and brother. Occasionally, she looked at the walls and the floor as if suspicious. Jackie, for his part, found a dangerous playground in the mill. The old gears became mountains, the piles of burlap turned into fortresses, and every crack in the floorboard was an invitation to investigate what lay beneath. The news that Mary Dolores and her 3 children had moved into the old mill spread through the region faster than a wagon going downhill. On the way to the general store 2 days after the move, Mary felt curious stares and heard some whispers. Folks who used to greet her with a cordial wave now made a half-hidden sign of the cross when she passed. Some approached just to ask, with false interest, if she wasn't afraid of living in the basin. Others pretended the subject didn't concern them, but strained their ears to catch any scrap of an answer. At Mr. Amos's store, the atmosphere was a mix of commerce and gossip radio. While weighing sugar, coffee and kerosene, the owner chatted with a customer about the drought that insisted on punishing the region. When Mary entered, the buzz changed tone slightly. Mr. Amos greeted her with a yellow smile, asking how the adjustment to the mill was going. She replied that they were managing, that at least they had a roof. One of the men leaning against the counter commented, loud enough for everyone to hear, that a widow's courage was something to be respected, but that he, were he in her shoes, would prefer sleeping on the roadside than in that place. Another said that a legend is a legend, and that if everyone believed in ghosts, nobody would work the fields at dawn. Someone cited in a lower tone that the basin held an ancient secret, big family business, and that it wasn't good to poke around. That night, back at the mill, with a little flour, salt, tallow for the lamp, and coffee wrapped in brown paper, Mary stood for a moment at the door before entering. The sky was clear, full of stars. The air had cooled a bit with nightfall. In the distance, the croaking of frogs announced the little water that still resisted at the edges of the creek. The wind passed through the tops of the crop rows with a constant, almost hypnotic sound. She closed her eyes for an instant and tried to listen only to the present, her children laughing inside, Anne arranging the mattresses, Jackie recounting excitedly how he had found a small gear that was now the steering wheel of his imaginary truck. But even so, deep in her ear, there seemed to be another sound, older, thinner, which memory insisted on adding to that landscape, a stubborn cry, asking to be noticed. It was on an afternoon of stronger wind, a few days later, that the first concrete clue to the mystery appeared. The sun was still high, but thin clouds raced quickly across the sky, announcing a change in weather that might not come in the form of rain, but made itself present in the agitation of the leaves. Inside the mill, the air was heavy, smelling of hot wood and dust. Mary was washing a few clothes in a basin, using water Jackie had brought from the creek. Anne was hanging some pieces on a makeshift line near the window. Tess played at arranging and disarranging a small wooden box with old buttons that had belonged to Mary's adoptive grandmother. Jackie, as always, roamed the space with his wooden car, making engine noises with his mouth. He had invented an imaginary road that started near the door and looped several times around the mill. At a certain moment, he decided the car needed to face a steeper descent. He guided the toy near the old office of the mill, a slightly elevated room with a wooden step separating it from the rest of the main floor. He pushed the car hard, pretending it was going down a high mountain. The toy ran spiritedly for a few inches, and in a second of carelessness slipped from his fingers and went straight into a gap between two floorboards. There was a small, dry sound, and the car disappeared. The boy jumped back, surprised. He called his mother, saying the floor had swallowed his toy. Mary dropped the laundry she was wringing, quickly dried her hands on her apron, and went to the spot. She knelt, peered into the crack, but it was too dark down there to see anything. She tapped her knuckles on the wider board, right where the car had vanished, and noticed immediately a different sound. While the rest of the floor responded with a fuller noise of wood solidly supported on beams, that specific board sounded hollow. Mary frowned and tapped again, now using the handle of a wooden spoon she found nearby. The sound confirmed the impression. There was an empty space underneath. A shiver went up her back. For an instant, Ms. Hattie's words about buried secrets in that basin surfaced. But at the same time, the practical mind of someone who had spent a lifetime improvising solutions to hard problems spoke louder. If the car had fallen there was a way to reach it. And if there was a hole, she needed to know what it was about. She asked Anne to hold Tess further back, just in case the board gave way suddenly, and went in search of an old knife she had used to peel cassava earlier. Carefully, she forced the blade into the side of the board, where it met the next one. The wood resisted a little, like something that dislikes being disturbed after a long time quiet. A thin creak filled the air. Jackie watched everything with eyes shining with curiosity. After a few minutes of effort, the board lifted a few inches. Mary slipped her fingers into the opening, feeling splinters scratch her skin, and pulled hard. The wood rose slowly, revealing a dark void just below. The smell that came out was different from the rest of the mill. Ancient dampness, iron, paper kept for too long. Her eyes took a while to adjust to the darkness of that narrow space. At first glance, she saw only Jackie's car tipped on its side, and next to it, something elongated and metallic wrapped in a layer of dust. It looked like a rusty metal cylinder about the size of an adult's arm, perhaps a little shorter. Mary's heart accelerated. She stayed motionless for a few seconds, hearing only her own breathing and the distant sound of the wind outside. Part of her wanted to cover the board back up, pretend she hadn't seen anything, tell the boy the car was lost forever, and go on with her hard, familiar life. Another part, however, was pulled by a deep curiosity, that same curiosity that made her, as a child, ask about her origins and never be satisfied with vague answers that she had been found crying around somewhere. With a decisive movement, she knelt, reached her arm into the gap, and felt around until she touched the cold metal of the cylinder. The surface was irregular, with spots of rust that scratched her skin. She pulled carefully, feeling the object's weight. It wasn't light or empty. There was something inside. The sound it made when it finally emerged from the hiding place and touched the floor had a deep tone of filled metal. Anne watched the scene with a furrowed brow. Tess, now in her sister's lap, sucked her thumb, her eyes like two dark balls fixed on her mother. Jackie took a few steps closer, but stopped when he felt the tension in the air, as if realizing that in that moment the game of cars had bumped into something much bigger. Mary ran her hand over the cylinder, looking for an opening, a lid, anything. She found on one end a lighter metal ring, slightly movable. She pulled with moderate force, and the lid gave way with a low hiss, as if the air trapped inside for years was finally being released. From inside, she first pulled out a bundle of cloth, faded by time, but still intact. She unrolled it carefully, revealing a notebook with a darkened leather cover. The texture was soft, yet firm, as if, despite the years, it had been made to last. There were also some folded sheets tied with thin twine and what appeared to be a stack of letters. Mary felt her heart beat in her throat. Her hands, calloused from the hoe and washing clothes in cold water, trembled slightly as she opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting she saw there was slanted, neat, from someone who had studied more than anyone she knew. At the top, a simple title written with firm strokes, Book of Atonement. Just below, the opening words seemed to speak directly to her. There, someone said they were writing for the child who was almost erased from this world, and for the one who, one day, has the courage to return to her what is rightfully hers. Mary felt a knot form in her stomach. The expression "child" almost erased echoed in her head, as if it had been placed there just to poke a wound she pretended not to have. She closed the notebook for a moment, pressing the cover against her chest, like someone trying to hold their emotions in with their arms. The smell of old leather mixed with the dust of time invaded her nose. The mill, with its creaks, the wind outside, the children standing looking at her, everything seemed to fade away for a few seconds, as if in that moment only she and those mysterious words existed. That was when a different sound cut through the air. Outside, not very far away, came the muffled trample of hooves on the dirt, then the metallic noise of a bridle and the creak of a saddle. A male voice, a bit distant, called out a name Mary didn't immediately recognize. Then another voice answered, lower. She reacted on instinct. She closed the notebook hurriedly, shoved the cylinder back into the gap, and lowered the board, adjusting it as best she could so that, at first glance, no one would notice it had been moved. She told Anne to grab the laundry bucket and pretend they were there just washing and tidying. She ordered Jackie not to say a word about the car or the hole. With her heart racing, she walked to one of the wider cracks in the wall and peeked out. Further ahead, standing on the dry earth, were two horses. On one of them sat Colonel Jackson Brandon III, with the same light hat, neat vest, and controlled expression as always. On the other, a younger man, with a dark hat and hard eyes, whom Mary recognized as one of the Colonel's closest henchmen. They were talking in voices low enough that she couldn't catch the words, but the tone was grave. At one point, the Colonel turned his face toward the mill, narrowed his eyes as if trying to see through the wood, and said something that made the henchman agree with a half-smile. Mary's entire body went on alert. She didn't know yet exactly what she had in her hands, but in that instant, she was certain of two things. This wasn't a small thing, and the man out there couldn't find out. A few weeks passed since the day Mary lifted the floorboard and found the metal cylinder hidden in the dark belly of the mill. Time, in that dry April of 1923, seemed to flow in a strange way. The days were identical, marked by strong sun, dust, and work, but the nights had gained a different weight, as if they always hid something more than the usual fatigue. On the outside, life went on hard, with the same chores as always. Inside, however, a secret now burned in silence, like an ember kept beneath the ash. As days went by, Mary created a ritual of her own. During the day, she hid the cylinder under a pile of old sacks, carefully arranged in a corner that didn't seem to attract anyone's attention. Occasionally, she went over there, pretending to sweep, adjusted the sacks naturally, and checked with her foot if the wood underneath still held the weight firmly. At night, when the children were already asleep, and the silence of the mill mixed with the rustling of the fields outside, she lit the lamp with a light hand, adjusted the wick to save kerosene, and only then sought the cylinder. She sat on an overturned crate near the wall, placed the leather-bound notebook on her lap, and opened it to the page marked with a small piece of cloth. The yellow light of the lamp barely managed to illuminate the slanted, neat letters, but Mary had already gotten used to bringing her face close to the paper, eyes half closed, like someone trying to see a world never meant for folks like her to read. She read slowly, syllable by syllable, mentally repeating the words until they made whole sense inside her head. Each night brought a new piece of the story that man, Alphonse Brandon, had decided to write near the end of his life. He began by speaking of guilt, of fear of God's punishment, of sleepless nights hearing inside his own memory a child's cry that he swore the wind brought back every now and then, even years after the event. He said he had allowed an older, harder brother to order an unwanted child away from the house, the fruit of a relationship the family deemed shameful. He didn't go into detail about who the mother was, referring to her only as a poor girl with very dark eyes who had been left with an empty promise of help. In subsequent pages, Alphonse recounted that, tormented by remorse, he ordered a trusted young man, on a cold dawn, to go into the middle of the basin's fields, following the sound of a cry that insisted on tearing through the night. He ordered that, if he found the child still alive, to take her to a couple of discreet tenant farmers, decent folks, but without a voice on the estate. And he noted there that he would separate a specific part of the lands, a plot with well-defined markers, to one day be returned to that child, should she survive. He drew the boundaries of the terrain with words, speaking of stones driven into an alignment, a stretch of the middle creek that made a wide curve, and a small grove of inga trees that served as a reference. Reading that left Mary short of breath. The expression "child almost erased" appeared more than once in the text, as if Alphonse couldn't escape the very image he had created. On a certain page, he wrote that he knew, deep in his heart, that child could have been his salvation had she been welcomed, but pride and fear of scandal spoke louder. On another, he said that if anyone ever found that notebook, it would likely be because God had decided it was time to straighten, at least in part, a crooked history. The more she read, the more Mary felt her entire past changing colour. She remembered when she was still small, and her adoptive mother, Ms. Augusta, told her, almost always with a mix of affection and reserve, that she had been found crying in the middle of the world. Not many details ever followed that phrase. Whenever Mary insisted on knowing exactly where, who found her, how it was, the woman changed the subject, said it wasn't good to go poking at what God had decided to keep. Miss Augusta's husband, Mr. Raymond, merely repeated that they would have done worse if they had turned their face from the crying. That was it. No mention of a landowner, of orders, of a specific dawn. Now, however, the dates, the places, the words of the notebook began to fit into the cracks of the little she knew about herself. On one of those nights, when she closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest, Mary felt a sob trapped in her throat that wasn't a child's nor a newborn's forgotten in an open field. It was the cry of a tired woman who, for the first time, glimpsed the possibility that her life had been, from the start, decided from a distance by hands that never held her. She held back the tears, not out of shame, but because she knew every sob would wake questions in her children, and it wasn't time yet to mix those truths with the restless sleep of the three little ones. While the secret grew inside her, practical life insisted on demanding decisions. Food was running low fast. There are few days when a handful of beans, a bit of flour, and a little lard can fool the stomachs of 4 people. The garden Mary had started planting was still just green scratches on the ground. The work of washing clothes out at the tap of a merchant's house in the village yielded little. To top it off, Tess began to cough more insistently, a dry cough accompanied by a low fever that rose at nightfall, leaving the girl with eyes shining from fatigue. On one of those late afternoons, with Tess burning hot in her lap and cold sweat running down her daughter's neck, Mary felt an almost physical despair rise through her body. She thought about what was hidden under the boards. She thought about the folded sheets with the measurements of the promised land. She thought about the letter addressed to the girl from the fields. And for the first time, she seriously considered the idea of using that to wring something from the colonel before it was too late. The doubt, however, came along with fear. What if it was all worthless? What if the colonel laughed in her face, calling those sheets the scribbles of a regretful old man that never reached the courthouse? What if he decided that someone meddling in family papers deserved punishment greater than debt at the store and eviction? What if the children paid for their mother's boldness? It was in this bind that she decided to seek out Mr. Arthur. The old retired clerk lived in the village, in a low house near the little church, always with glasses slipping down his nose and an old pen tucked behind his ear, as if the habit of writing had never left him. He was known for still understanding legal letters, deed formulas, and ways to organize paper. If anyone could say if those documents meant anything in the world of rich men, it was him. On a day of white sky and sticky heat, Mary put on her best dress, tied her hair with a slightly cleaner kerchief, and hid, carefully folded, one of the sheets from the stack inside her bodice next to her chest. She left early before the sun got too high, telling the children she was going to the store and would return with coffee and salt, God willing. Anne was left in charge of watching her siblings, with repeated warnings for no one to get too close to the windows in case anyone appeared in front of the mill. Arriving in the village was always a mix of estrangement and necessity. The dirt streets had more movement. Wagons came and went. Women carried tins of water on their heads. Men argued over the price of cotton and cattle. In front of the church, some ladies prayed the rosary in the shade of a large mango tree. Children ran barefoot, laughing at things as simple as pieces of wood turning into swords. Mary, holding the hem of her dress to avoid tripping in the potholes, walked quickly, her heart determined, and her face trying not to show her unease. When she knocked at Mr. Arthur's door, she was greeted by the smell of old paper and dry ink. The old man appeared at the door adjusting his glasses, surprised to see that woman from the fields there. He asked what he could do for her, with a respect that came more from age than position. Mary, after taking a deep breath, said she needed to understand an old paper that had fallen into her hands. She didn't say immediately from where, nor from whom. She asked only that he read it and say honestly if it was worth anything in this world. Inside the cramped house, full of stacks of paper leaning against the walls and a desk that looked like it had seen better days, Mary removed, with slightly trembling hands, the sheet from where she had hidden it. She handed it to the old man, who took it carefully as if the very gesture of touching paper required respect. He brought it close to his eyes, read in silence for a few minutes, while the sound of the street came muffled through the wooden window. As he read, Mr. Arthur's expression changed. First mild curiosity, then clearer surprise. He murmured to himself the name Alphonse Brandon, recognizing the signature in a corner. He commented that he had seen that handwriting in old estate ledgers many years ago, when he still spent entire nights copying deeds by lamplight. He read a second time the descriptions of the land boundaries, the stone markers, the indication of Middle Creek, the grove of Ingus. Finally he raised his eyes to Mary and said in a low voice that this, if used the right way, could shake half the certainty the colonel had about his own possessions. The words, "shake half the certainty," sent a chill down Mary's spine. Before she could reply, however, Mr. Arthur, excited by the discovery, commented that this was too big a matter to stay within four walls. He said it was a shame what these big families had done and undone without anyone knowing, and that God sometimes chose simple people to bring to light what had been hidden. He spoke louder than he should have, and without realizing it, when he went to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water for his visitor, he left the parlour door half open. On the street, two men resting against the wall of the neighbouring house heard through the crack loose snippets. The name Brandon, talk of promised land, mention of old paper. They didn't understand everything, but they understood enough to, later at Mr. Amos's store, tell the story the way country folk know how to do, piecing bits together, enlarging some, diminishing others, seasoning it with their own opinion. On the way back to the mill, Mary already felt she had done something dangerous. Mr. Arthur had promised to keep the secret, had said no one needed to know she was there, but life experience had taught her that words, once loose, are like feathers from a torn pillow in the wind. They never return to exactly the same place. Even so, carrying in her chest the confirmation that those papers weren't just a regretful old man's scribbles gave her new strength. Now, it wasn't just a feeling. It was something concrete, with recognized handwriting, with exact measurements. That same late afternoon, however, the colonel also received news. One of the men who had heard the conversation from a distance approached him at the store in a fawning tone and recounted slowly, like someone sure they are bringing something valuable. Said the widow from the mill was messing with old papers, big people business, stuff signed by an old Brandon. The colonel listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on a random spot on the wall, as if the news stirred nothing inside. Only when the fellow finished did he smile slightly, a smile that didn't come near his eyes, and said that poor folks sometimes mistake a cake recipe for a land deed. The next morning, while the sun was still slowly warming the coffee-drying yard, the sound of hooves on dry earth announced the arrival of visitors to the mill. Mary, who was cleaning the area near the door, recognized from afar the shine of Colonel Jackson's light vest and the posture of the well-groomed horse he rode. Beside him, on a darker animal, came the same henchman she had seen from the crack days before, the man with the hard look and hat pulled down, almost hiding his eyebrows. The colonel dismounted calmly, adjusted his hat, brushed an imaginary grain of dust from his vest with his fingertips, and called Mary by name, with a voice too smooth for the situation. She approached, hands still dirty with dust, heart beating so loud it seemed to want to exit her chest. The children, instinctively, stayed near the door, behind her, like chicks that don't stray from the hen on a day of strange shadows. He began by asking how they were adapting to the place, if the mill suited them, if the widow was grateful for the chance to have a roof when she could be on the road. Mary replied yes, that they were managing, that she was thankful. Her words came out measured, without exaggerated humility, without open defiance. The colonel looked around, stepped a few paces into the mill, treading the floorboards with clean boots that contrasted with the worn wood. The sound of his steps echoed differently inside there, as if the place itself found those souls that always walked on big house floors strange. He commented that it had been a long time since he set foot in that building, that it was a pity to see such a structure idle. He asked if she hadn't found anything interesting around there, no leftover tools, no metal piece that could be sold as scrap. He asked if she had messed with the floor, because according to him, an old place like this always holds surprises, rats, snakes, sometimes even hiding places of people who stole things in the past. Mary felt her face heat up. She said she had only swept, that she was too busy dealing with food and caring for the children to go poking in holes. She stated that if she found anything belonging to the estate, she would hand it over, as she always did. The colonel nodded, but his eyes roamed the floor as if they knew more than his mouth said. He approached, by instinct or information, precisely the area where the board had been lifted. He tapped it with the toe of his boot, as if testing its firmness. The sound revealed nothing beyond the little wood that, from the outside, looked just like the others. After a few minutes of conversation full of half-words, the colonel turned to leave. Before mounting his horse again, however, he looked straight into Mary's eyes and commented, in a tone that seemed friendly but held something of ice. He said that in life, the worst a poor person can do is get involved with things they don't understand. He stated that family papers are family business, that stirring up old memories can bring new misfortune, and that he wouldn't like to see such a hard-working widow end up carrying guilt for too much curiosity. Then, with a tip of his hat that mimicked affection, he mounted and rode away, leaving behind a trail of dust and threat. From that day on, the sensation of surveillance became heavier. Mary noticed, when she went to the village, that more eyes than before followed her, some with pity, others with suspicion, still others with a strange glint of expectation, as if she were suddenly the main character of a story folks wanted to see to the end, even if for the tragedy. At the store, the subject lowered in tone when she entered. The priest, when he passed her on the street, greeted her with a quick blessing, but his eyes avoided lingering on her face. It was also in these days that fate decided to put Ethan Nash in the family's path. It was late morning, the sun already high, heating the air to the point of making the cicadas go crazy in the trees. Jackie had gone to a higher part of the road to fetch some dry branches that had fallen from an angico tree, good stuff to feed the fire. On the way back, distracted, he ended up passing too close to the small orchard near the big house, a stretch of poorly maintained fence separating the tenant's world from the colonel's world. One of the henchmen, the same man with the hard look, saw him and, perhaps seizing the chance to take out some frustration, shouted from the shade of a tree asking what the boy was doing there. Before Jackie could answer, the fellow accused in a loud voice that he was wanting to steal oranges, that a widow's boy without a man always ends up getting used to the wrong path. He grabbed the boy's arm tightly, shaking him as if wanting the words to come out along with the fear. Jackie tried to explain, voice breaking, that he had only cut through, that he hadn't touched any fruit. The henchman, however, squeezed even harder, saying that a small thief turns into a big thief if he doesn't learn early. The boy felt his skin burn with shame, not just from the grip, but from the words that echoed everything he feared the world thought of his family now. It was at that moment that the sound of hooves approaching in a firm but unhurried rhythm was heard. A tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark felt hat and face burned by the sun, stopped his horse a few yards from the two. It was Ethan Nash, the drover who always walked with half a dozen head of lean cattle behind him, taking and bringing orders between estates and villages. He observed the scene for a few seconds without saying anything. He saw the henchman's thick hand squeezing the boy's thin arm, saw the fear in Jackie's eyes, saw the unnecessarily cruel way the words were thrown. Then he dismounted calmly. He approached, stood beside the two, and with a firm but controlled voice, asked if something serious had happened there to justify holding a child like that. The henchman replied with arrogance, saying he'd caught a little orange thief red-handed. Ethan looked at the ground, saw there was no fallen fruit, no sign of theft. He looked again at the boy, and then at the man. He said he knew Jackie by sight, knew where he came from, knew his family worried more about lack of food than gluttony for fruit. He asked with discreet irony if the henchman didn't have anything more important to do than measure strength with a scrawny boy. The conversation heated up a few degrees, but Ethan didn't raise his voice. He merely reminded him, sounding like he was mentioning it in passing, that the henchman still owed him an old favor from a time he almost lost his job over a misunderstood rumor, and the drover had served as a witness in his favor. He said it would be a shame now to have to tell the same story again to important people, but this time with details that wouldn't leave the man looking good in the picture. The message was delivered. The henchman loosened his fingers, let go of Jackie's arm with a shove, and grumbled that this wouldn't stay like this. He turned his back and walked away. Ethan crouched down until he was at the boy's height. He asked if he was okay, if it hurt. Jackie, face still red and eyes watering, nodded yes, but the shame seemed heavier than the pain. The drover then suggested he accompany him back to the mill, at least for that stretch of the road. He said it cost nothing to gain good company for a few minutes. On the way, Ethan asked how things were over there, what it was like living in the mill. The boy replied in pieces that it was dark, but his mother said you could get used to it, that the wind sometimes sounded like people talking in the cotton field, and that he had a wooden car that had almost been swallowed by the floor, but then appeared again. The drover listened to everything carefully, storing every word like someone gathering pieces of a puzzle he already knows, part of the design of. When they arrived at the mill door, Mary found it strange to see her son returning escorted by a man on horseback. She came out immediately, drying her hands on her skirt, heart on alert. Ethan introduced himself, explained what had happened at the edge of the orchard, told how he had found the boy with his arm held, and decided to intervene. He spoke in a respectful tone, making it clear he didn't expect thanks, but thought it fair she knew. Mary listened with her jaw set, a mix of gratitude and anger at the abuse her son suffered. From that day on, Ethan's presence began to become more frequent around the mill. Sometimes he passed just waving from afar, handling his own business. Others, he stopped to offer help with a heavier load or to warn of rumors running through the village. It was in one of those conversations, on an afternoon when the sun went down behind the hills and painted the fields a tired gold, that he let slip he had already heard talk of old paper messing with land of the Brandon family. The way he looked at Mary when saying this revealed it wasn't just store gossip he carried. She hesitated, thought about denying, about pretending she didn't know what he was talking about. But the memory of him defending Jackie on the road, the way his eyes didn't flee, the posture of someone who knew in their skin the weight of injustice. All this made her change her mind. For the first time, outside the walls of the mill and far from the curious ears of the village, she admitted she had found something hidden in the floor, although she didn't go into details immediately. The drover listened without interrupting to the story of the board, the cylinder, the notebook. When she mentioned the name Alphonse Brandon and the words Book of Atonement, a strange gleam passed through his eyes, a gleam of recognition and astonishment at the same time. He took a deep breath, looked around to make sure no one was close enough to hear, and said that story had been crossing his family too for many years. Before continuing this part, the narrator pauses to look directly at whoever is listening to all this. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and share it with someone who needs to believe that even those born to be forgotten can find justice and a place in the world. This gesture helps more people know this narrative and makes these voices from the heartland reach even further. Back to that late afternoon, sitting on a wooden stump near the mill door, Ethan began to tell, in a low voice, that his father, when he was still young, had worked as a drover for the estate itself. At that time, Alphonse Brandon was already an aging man, health faltering, but still commanded in a way the big house. One night, almost at the turn of the century, Ethan's father was called aside, far from the ears of the rest of the hands. According to what the old man told him years later, Alphonse had asked him to go, before daybreak, into the middle of the basin's cotton fields, following the sound of a child's cry that, according to him, the wind constantly brought to his memory. He ordered that, if he found a live baby, to ask no questions, just bring it back hidden, without anyone knowing, and then take it discreetly to a family of tenant farmers in another part of the estate. He promised he would see to it that nothing was lacking for that family as long as they kept quiet. Ethan's father, young at the time and used to obeying without question, did as ordered. He went to where the crying guided him, found, wrapped in a poor cloth, a small child, face red from so much crying. He told his son years later that when he picked up that small body, he felt a heat rise in his chest, a mix of revolt and compassion he had never experienced. He followed the agreement, took the child to a couple who lived far off, folks known for having good hearts and few resources. And shortly after, realized he received, in exchange for silence, an extra piece of field, cattle he didn't expect, small favors that smelled of payment for guilt. While Ethan spoke, Mary felt the floor of the mill get thicker, as if the boards carried besides their weight, the weight of decades of secrets. When he finished the story, there was a thick silence between the two. She asked if his father knew what happened to the child afterward. He replied that, over the years, he heard say she grew strong, was registered with another last name, was raised as a daughter, though not everyone in the house forgot she had come from the brush, from the middle of a cry no one wanted to claim. Mary didn't say aloud what passed through her head, but in that instant, something in her almost screamed that this child could very well be her. The year matched, the place matched, the way her adoptive mother told her origin matched. Everything seemed to point to the same conclusion that at the same time frightened her and rooted her in a new way to that piece of ground. It wasn't any more just the story of a widow evicted to an old mill. It was the story of someone whose entire life had begun in that same type of basin, to the sound of an ignored cry. As time passed, the pressure outside increased. The Colonel, already bothered by the news of conversations at Mr. Arthur's house and Ethan's frequent visits to the mill, began to act more aggressively. He sent, on a certain moonless night, 2 men to circle around the structure, under the pretext of looking for a heifer that had strayed in the dawn. The heavy steps on the dry earth, the snapping of trampled branches, and the muffled murmur of their voices cut the silence of the mill, making a distant neighbor's dogs bark in sequence. Inside, Mary ordered the children to stay quiet, almost without breathing. She put out the lamp ahead of time, staying only with the weak clarity entering through some crack high up. Her heart marked every second, as if it were a clock out of rhythm, announcing the possibility of disaster. She heard when one of the men commented in a louder voice that the place smelled of old things stirred up, that poor folks, when they think they're smart, always forget they have nowhere to run. The other laughed, saying that if they really had to remove the widow from there, it would be in a single shove, along with the junk and the kids. The immediate danger passed, and after an almost sleepless night, Mary realized she couldn't keep the secret alone anymore. The next morning, when Ethan appeared bringing a sack of cornmeal he said was left over from a delivery, she took courage and showed him the complete hiding place, lifted the board, removed the cylinder, placed the leather-bound notebook on top of the crate, and with a voice still trembling, read aloud some passages she already knew almost by heart. The drover listened to the reading attentively, elbows resting on his knees, body leaning forward. When she finished, he ran his hand over his face, like someone trying to organize too many thoughts. He said this wasn't a small thing. He said that if those documents came to public light, it wouldn't just be her life that would shift. There would be ramifications for the very image of the Brandon family, for the way the village saw them, for the power relations established there for decades. It was at this point that Mary's moral dilemma became clearer than ever. She could, if she wanted, use those papers to try to wring a favorable negotiation with the colonel. Guarantee a piece of land in exchange for silence, use his fear to alleviate her children's hunger. She could also look for outsiders, maybe a lawyer in a bigger city, and try in a long and risky process to force the justice of men to recognize what that old man in writing had already recognized. Each possibility had a price. Each path required a different kind of courage. Ethan, instead of ordering or deciding for her, placed the question honestly. He said he knew the anger of someone who has already lost land to a colonel's penstroke, knew the bitter taste of seeing one's own story written by another. He recounted, in detail, how his family had been pushed off a farm that was once theirs, due to a debt that grew strangely in the store ledger until it became an argument to confiscate everything. He said he didn't wish that feeling on anyone, but also had seen what happened to those who stood up against that kind of power, without thinking well about the support they'd have. As they spoke, the bond between the two strengthened not by promise of romance, but by recognition of similar pain. Mary saw in Ethan someone who carried in body and memories scars that rhymed with hers. He, in turn, saw in that woman of firm gaze a stubbornness that went beyond daily survival. There was in her a seed of indignation that, if well tended, could generate something bigger than simply swapping one tenant house for another. It was in a longer conversation, on an afternoon when clouds finally gathered in the sky, as if, who knows, deciding to give a truce to the drought, that Ethan, cornered by his own conscience, decided to reveal what he had been holding back for years. He told Mary, with pauses and deep breaths, that it wasn't just a second-hand story he brought. His father, before dying, had confessed in one of those moments when the tongue releases things that no longer fit in the chest, that he suspected the girl he rescued in the middle of the cotton field had become, years later, the farmhand known as Mary Dolores Fields. The reasons for the suspicion were several: the date she appeared in Ms. Augusta's life, the way the former mistress spoke of having welcomed a child brought under secrecy, the extra care that occasionally Alphonse took with that family of tenants, without ever admitting it was because of the girl. Nothing was definitive proof, but everything formed a design that in the head of a simple man like Ethan's father seemed too clear to be coincidence. When these words reached Mary's ears, she felt the air of the mill become heavier and, paradoxically, sharper. It was as if suddenly someone had lit a stronger lamp inside a room full of shadows. The mix of emotions was almost impossible to describe. Anger at how her life had been manipulated since before she knew her own name. Sadness at the certainty she would never have a direct answer from the mouth of who made the decisions. And a strange sensation of painful belonging to that piece of land that for so long had only treated her as labor or temporary favor. She stood up, walked back and forth on the floorboards, feeling the wood creak under her feet. She looked at the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as if she wanted to etch in memory every nail, every splinter of wood. At a certain moment she stopped, faced Ethan, and said she didn't know yet exactly what she would do with that information, but she knew, with a clarity she had never felt before, that she would no longer be the woman who bows her head and thanks for any scrap. She turned her gaze to the notebook, resting open on the crate, and had the impression that the words written there were waiting, from the first stroke of ink, for someone willing to break the cycle of silence. Outside, the wind began to change direction. The leaves of the cotton plants agitated differently, as if the landscape itself, which carried the echo of an ancient cry, also sensed that something important was about to happen. Inside the mill, among boards that kept secrets for more than 30 years, two simple people marked by losses were making, without realizing, the kind of silent decision that, little by little, changes not only one's own life, but the way an entire community looks at the story they were always told. In the days that followed that conversation, where Ethan finally opened the weight of the story he carried, the air around the Brandon estate seemed to get denser. The sky remained the same, streaked with thin clouds that rarely gathered into rain, but relations between people changed tone, as if an invisible storm approached. Nothing happened immediately in plain sight, but the tiny signs were there for anyone who wanted to see. The colonel's henchmen began passing more frequently on the road leading to the mill, pretending to be after stray cattle or checking fences. The lingering looks toward Mary's door, the muffled whispers when they noticed any movement of children, all betrayed that it wasn't just interest in cows or wire. In the village, conversations at the store continued in the same circle as always, but occasionally someone would let slip, with a half-smile, that the widow better be careful with the stories she was stirring up, because too much paper has toppled big folks and crushed small ones. Father Henry, a middle-aged man who always preferred prudence to confrontation, began to appear more thoughtful in his few encounters with Mary. When he saw her at the church door, with a neater kerchief on her hair and the children by her side, he greeted with affection, but his eyes betrayed that he felt crushed between gratitude for the Brandon family's old favors and the growing discomfort regarding what he knew of the past. In one of these quick conversations, he went so far as to say, in a low voice, that God's justice has paths that men's justice doesn't follow, and that sometimes courage is needed not to be complicit in silence. Inside the mill, Mary knew the time for just reading and hiding was ending. The leather-bound notebook was no longer just a memory. It had become, step by step, a kind of mirror in which she saw not only the crime of others, but also the possibility of her own omission. Every night, closing the book, she felt a question hammer inside. How long would they accept that story remaining buried, as if a child's life could be treated like a debt forgotten in an accountant's drawer? It was on a morning of clear skies, with the wind kicking up light dust in the estate yard, that the confrontation began to take a more defined shape. Ethan arrived hurriedly at the mill, without the usual calm manner of someone who measures every step. The horse was sweaty, nostrils flaring, and the drover's felt hat was slightly crooked on his head, a sign of someone who mounted in a rush. He dismounted almost in a leap, called Mary outside, and told her that at the store he had heard something he couldn't ignore any longer. He said one of the men closest to the colonel had commented, thinking no one noticed, that the boss had decided to settle the issue of the mill widow once and for all. He spoke of sending people with prepared papers for her to sign, declaring she had no right to anything and that whatever she found there would be considered illegitimate possession, or worse, theft. There was mention of a possible eviction on short notice, under the argument that she was creating trouble with invented papers. Mary listened to this with a motionless face, but inside she felt a mix of anger and fear. It wasn't just the veiled threat from before anymore. Now there was a plan, a clear intention to tighten the noose. She took a deep breath, looked inside the mill, where Anne hung clothes and Jackie helped Tess play with old buttons, and realized that any decision she made there wouldn't be just for her. Every line of that notebook already dragged with it 3 small futures that depended on what their mother did. After a short, heavy silence, she told Ethan she couldn't back down anymore. She recounted that the night before, rereading the passage where Alphonse spoke directly to the child, almost erased from this world, she felt as never before that those words had been left for someone like her, not to continue moulding under a board. She said she could no longer bear the idea that the cry of that March dawn had been in vain, that someone had to finally answer it. Ethan, aware of the danger, proposed that nothing be done in the dark. He suggested that if she were to face the colonel, it should be in front of witnesses, with as much light as possible. He said they could count on Mr. Arthur to read and explain the papers in front of others, that they could call some people who knew pieces of the story, like Miss Hattie, and even involve Father Henry himself if he had the courage to put the weight of the cassock in favor of the truth instead of just convenience. The idea of opening the heart of the secret in front of more people scared Mary at first sight. She always knew the value silence had for a poor person's survival in Colonel country. But she also knew that alone, in any room with a paper in front and the power of the other across the table, she wouldn't stand a chance. She said she needed to think, but time was short. The drover replied he had already started moving. The day before, he had spoken to Mr. Arthur, who, frightened and excited at the same time, agreed to help, providing it wasn't in absolute secret, because he didn't want to die being the only one knowing such a big thing. In the following hours, as the sun rose and fell, a kind of silent network formed. Ethan went to the village, talked to the old clerk, arranged a meeting at the mill for a few days later, in high morning, when the light exposes even dust kept in a forgotten corner. He also stopped by Ms. Hattie's house, who, even with weak legs, stated that if necessary she would drag herself to the basin to tell what she heard that dawn in 1891. In a careful conversation, he went to the rectory and, in a mix of respect and boldness, told the priest that perhaps the time had come for him to choose between repeating a litany of submission or putting the sermon into practice. Father Henry listened to the request with a furrowed brow. He said he couldn't take sides in people's fights over paper, Ethan retorted, with the calm of someone who has thought over the words more than once, that it wasn't just about paper, but recognition of an old crime, of a child thrown in the field, of a life built on top of that injustice. The priest, visibly touched, promised nothing there, but upon saying goodbye, let slip that if he were called to hear the reading of anything having to do with confession of sin or atonement, he wouldn't have the courage to pretend he didn't hear. Meanwhile, at the big house, Colonel Jackson refined his own plans. He called the foreman, spoke with 2 trusted men, and determined that on a certain day, shortly after sunrise, they would go together to the mill with prepared documents to demand the widow sign the acknowledgement that she had nothing to claim. He said he wanted to end that gossip of hidden paper and book of guilt. The order was clear. Either Mary handed over whatever she had found, or she would be put out of the mill without right to further conversation. When the news, albeit in the form of a hunch, reached Mary's ears through Ethan's mouth, the final decision aligned inside her. It wouldn't be in a room of the big house that she would face that man. The confrontation would happen there, where that child's cry echoed one day, where the book was hidden, where the boards kept for decades the secret that now knocked at everyone's door. And it wouldn't just be between two. There would be other eyes, other ears, so no one could later say they didn't know. On the eve of the marked day, the night seemed longer than the previous ones. The children sensed, even without understanding details, that something important approached. Tess asked more than once if they were going to have to leave the mill. Anne, silent as always, observed her mother with redoubled attention, like someone trying to read in an expression what words still don't bring. Jackie, divided between fear and a kind of pride, knowing the family wasn't just cowering, spent a good part of the night awake, listening for any noise from outside. Before putting them to bed, Mary gathered them near the lamp and spoke calmly. She said that the next day the Colonel would come there and that they would all together hear things that might hurt, but were necessary. She guaranteed no one would be taken by force without the world seeing. She asked them to trust her and that, whatever happened, to remember they weren't wrong for existing. The children hugged her each in their own way. Tess, with her face buried in her mother's neck, Anne with arms firm around her waist, Jackie with a handshake trying to be manly. When the sun began to brighten the horizon, still shy but already cutting the shadows of the hills, the sound of hooves approaching broke the stillness of the basin. Mary, who was already up, arranging her hair in a black kerchief and adjusting the most intact dress she owned, felt her heart speed up, but her feet remained firm on the ground. The children peeked through the crack in the door, saw the dust rise on the dirt path, and the horses approaching with men in hats and upright posture. Colonel Jackson came in front, riding his light horse, vest aligned, face serious. Behind, two henchmen, one of them the same hard-faced one who had grabbed Jackie's arm. The scene had something of a cortege, but instead of music, it brought only the dull friction of hooves and the light noise of tack. They stopped in front of the mill. The Colonel dismounted, took a leather folder from under his arm, and advanced to the door without asking permission, as he had always done his whole life. Mary received him from the inside, a few steps away, with the children positioned behind her, but not hidden. The Colonel took a general look at the interior of the mill as if wanting to register every detail for later use. Then he opened the folder, took out some papers and said, in a tone mixing false kindness with authority, that he had come to resolve that situation once and for all. He explained that folks were saying she had found things that didn't belong to her, that she was messing with family documents, encouraged by people who don't know their place. He stated that, to avoid confusion and misunderstandings, he had brought a simple declaration in which she would recognize she had no right to any part of the estate, that any old paper found in the mill belonged to the Brandon family, and that she was grateful to continue living there for as long as the boss deemed convenient. Mary remained silent for a few seconds, letting every word find its own weight in the air. Then she asked if he really thought a forced signature would change what was already written in a higher place. The Colonel frowned, as if not used to hearing that kind of phrase coming from the mouth of a field woman. He said he didn't have time for philosophy, that he just wanted her to do her part so everyone could move on in peace. It was then she replied, with a firm voice, that she wouldn't sign anything. She said that in that mill, under those boards, there was more than rusty iron and rats. There were words written by a man who was already dead, but whose conscience had been more alive, at the end of his life, than that of many people still walking on those lands. She stated these words spoke of a child left to die in the middle of the field, of a regret, of a land set apart to repair what had been done, and that she, as that grown child, no longer accepted being treated as a favor or disposable. The henchman shifted uneasily, as if waiting for the Colonel to give a signal for the matter to be resolved with a shove. He, however, accustomed to measuring risks, still tried to keep his voice controlled. He said it was all delusion, talk of people wanting to take advantage of an old boss's senility, but before he could advance, he was interrupted by the sound of more hooves and steps coming from the road. Outside, a small group of people approached. At the front came Ethan, riding his usual horse, dark hat protecting his eyes from the stronger sun. Beside him, on muleback, came Mr. Arthur, with a paper folder on his lap and glasses well placed on his face despite the animal's sway. Walking on foot, leaning on a cane, came Miss Hattie, who seemed to have gathered strength she didn't know she still had. Behind them, some curious farmhands, two men who had worked for years on the estate drying yards, and to everyone's surprise, Father Henry himself, in a simple cassock and tense expression. When the group stopped before the mill, the colonel turned his body, irritated, asking what that unarranged meeting meant. Ethan replied, with the calm he used as a shield, that no one there was armed, that they didn't come for a physical fight, but thought it fair to be present, since whatever was decided on that ground would have consequences for the whole community. He said Mary wasn't alone, and that if there was paper to be shown, let it be read before everyone. The henchman made a move to argue, but the priest took a step forward, a rare thing when it came to opposing the colonel in public, and stated he had already heard of a book of atonement written by Alphonse Brandon, that if there was truth inside there, it was better brought to light than continuing to rot in secret. He said that, as a man of faith, he couldn't ignore the chance to see an ancient sin confessed, even if in writing, and an attempt at repair finally happen. Inside that dense atmosphere, Mary felt a thread of courage run through her from top to bottom. Without taking her eyes off the colonel, she walked to the corner where she kept the metal cylinder, lifted the board with a firm gesture, and, before everyone, removed the leather-bound notebook. The act itself had an almost ceremonial effect, raising that object before the man who, for so long, reigned there as if he owned everything. The paths and the words showed that, on that day, something different was at stake. She handed the book to Mr. Arthur, who held it with visible respect, like someone receiving a mission. The old man opened to the first page, adjusted his glasses, and after clearing his throat to banish the tremor in his voice, began to read aloud. Alphonse's words surfaced, one by one, cutting the silence like a scythe in tall grass. He spoke of guilt, of repentance, of a child left in the field to be forgotten, of a cry that traversed the night and was never forgotten, of a land set apart to try, however late, to return what had been stolen. As the reading advanced, the faces around changed. The older farmhands exchanged glances, remembering whispers they heard when they were just boys, the prohibition of certain subjects in the boss's presence. Ms. Hattie, eyes full of water, nodded at every mention of that March night, when the wind brought the sound of crying to her door. The priest, visibly shaken, clutched the rosary he held in his fingers, as if every sentence read weighed on his conscience, as a man who, for years, blessed the same family without asking many questions. Colonel Jackson tried, at first, to maintain a cold demeanor. At moments, he sketched a disbelieving smile, as if it were all theatre. At others, he clenched his jaw, hearing his own surname linked to words like sin and atonement. When Mr. Arthur reached the passage where Alphonse described the boundaries of the separated land, mentioning Middle Creek, the Inga Grove, the aligned stones, the colonel took a step forward and ordered the old man to stop reading, stating that was an internal family document without public value. Mr. Arthur, however, surprising even himself, replied that once written with the intention of repairing injustice, that book ceased to be just big house paper and became, in a way, a commitment before God and men. He said he had spent his life copying deeds, seeing land change owners with 2 signatures, and was tired of being an instrument of injustice. Now, old, he wanted at least once to be a bridge to something that brought the right closer to the possible. It was at this point, with tension at its peak, that the narrator's voice turns for an instant to those following this story from afar. If this story is touching your heart, you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and share with those you love. This simple gesture helps keep narratives like Mary's alive, showing that even the most forgotten cry can turn into a voice that changes destinies. Back to the dusty yard of the mill, the argument intensified. Colonel Jackson accused Mary and Ethan of using an old man's weakness to try and grab something that didn't belong to them. He said no judge would value a notebook kept in the dark, unregistered in a courthouse, and that if they wanted to proceed with that madness, they should prepare to face not only his wrath, but the laws. Some of the men around, used to obeying orders, took an involuntary step back, fearing a harsher conflict would erupt. But something had changed in the air. It was no longer just the colonel's word against the isolated fear of a family. Now there were other voices involved. One of the older farmhands, a man with thick hands and back arched from years of coffee sacks, took courage and spoke that he remembered seeing as a boy Ethan's father return at dawn, carrying a bundle that cried, and hearing his mother whisper that it had been something ordered by the big house to hide shame. He said he never repeated it out of fear, but could no longer stay silent. Miss Hattie, leaning on her cane, confirmed with a trembling voice that the crying of that night hadn't been the invention of impressionable folks. She told, before everyone, how she woke up, went to the fence, heard in the distance a cry that came and went with the wind. She said she always suspected it related to big family business, and that since then no one could walk the basin at dawn without feeling a tightness in the chest. The priest, for his part, took an even bolder step. He looked at the colonel and reminded him that in old confessions, members of his family had shown signs of a heavy conscience regarding decisions made in haste in the dead of night. He didn't reveal specific secrets out of respect for the sacrament, but made it clear that guilt was no news to God. He stated that, in the face of everything being read and confirmed, closing his eyes would be, for him, compacting with a lie that spanned generations. Cornered by words coming from different places, from his grandfather's handwriting, the workers' mouths, the old woman's memory. The weight of the cassock, the colonel realized his position was no longer as solid as the big house walls made it seem. He still tried to claim that, even so, no one there had the power to change anything without a judge's signature. It was then that Ethan intervened, not with a threat of physical force, but with the simple logic of someone who knows power relations in that kind of place well. He reminded him that if the colonel insisted on treating this as nothing, he ran the risk of seeing one day outsiders interested in digging through that past. He said that with so many people witnessing the reading of the book, it wouldn't be hard for someone to carry forward news that the estate's ownership was stained by a story of child abandonment. He said he might not understand legal formulas, but knew that in new times beginning to shape the country, a big family's reputation could also be put in check. He added that instead of seeing this as a threat, the colonel could choose to see it as a chance to, for the first time, honor what his own grandfather tried to do, however late and hidden. A chance to show he wasn't afraid of the truth, that he knew how to recognize a debt that wasn't just money, but life. A chance to turn a stain into a gesture of greatness if he had the courage. A heavy silence fell over everyone. The sound of the creek down below arrived sharper, as if the water, even scarce, wanted to remind them that everything there flows somewhere. The eyes of many were fixed on Jackson, waiting for an answer that could, from then on, be remembered in every conversation by a wood stove. For a few moments he seemed to fight an internal battle no one saw, but which manifested in a clenched jaw, a closed fist, a gaze shifting between the book, Mary, Ethan, the priest, and the workers. In the end, he let the air out through his teeth and said he wouldn't allow the family name to be dragged through the mud as if they were monsters. He stated that if all this served for anything, let it be to show that the Brandons knew, yes, how to recognize old mistakes. Without using the word guilt, but skirting it closely, he declared he would agree to a deal there before everyone. He said he would order the transfer of the plot described in the notebook to Mary Dolores Field's name registered in the courthouse with all formalities, recognizing her as the legitimate owner of that part of the lands, with the right to build her house and plant whatever she pleased. He also stated he wouldn't expel her from the mill while she didn't get settled there, and would guarantee free passage through the terrain until the new house was built. There was a murmur among those present. The proposal, coming from whom it came, sounded unthinkable until a few months ago. Mary, however, didn't let herself be intoxicated just by immediate relief. She remembered what she had read about atonement in the notebook, remembered the child left alone in the field, remembered so many other families who, like hers, spent their whole lives at the mercy of a boss's moods. She felt that if she accepted everything just for herself, she would be, in a way, repeating on a smaller scale the logic that always caused her pain. It was then that, with a voice still firm, she placed her condition. She said she accepted the land not as a gift, but as part of an old debt finally recognized, and that, with this same land, she wanted to go beyond what the Colonel's grandfather had imagined. She announced before everyone that once the papers were registered in her name, she would separate a piece of the plot by the creek to build a small school and a community space. A place where children from the fields could learn to read earlier than she did, where no one needed to bow because they didn't understand what a paper said. The reaction was immediate. Some looked at each other, surprised by the boldness of that woman who, until recently, was seen only as a widow broken by loss. The priest had a different shine in his eyes, as if seeing there the gospel in living flesh, more than in any Sunday homily. Mr. Arthur smiled for the first time in a long while, imagining a generation of boys and girls who might not need to depend on half a dozen people to comprehend their own history. The Colonel, confronted with this unexpected expansion, hesitated a second. He seemed to want to say no, but realized that in that moment, denying it would sound too small, too petty, even for someone used to commanding. He swallowed his dry pride, stroked his moustache, and said that if it was to end that discussion once and for all, and avoid bigger gossip, he agreed with designating part of the plot for said school and space. He made a point of making it clear this would be seen as an act of his generosity, but for anyone who heard the whole conversation, the gesture was understood differently. In the months that followed, things began to change in a way visible even to those passing far off. The first sign was the presence of Mary, Anne, Jackie, and Tess measuring the land by the middle creek with the help of Ethan and some men from the community. Using ropes, stones, pieces of wood, and Alphonse's notebook itself as a guide, they marked the space where the new house would be raised and where, right next to it, the future school would emerge. The work began simply, with adobe walls raised little by little, a mixture of clay, straw, and collective effort. Hands that previously served only to pick the Colonel's cotton now molded clay bricks for Mary's house. The children helped as they could, bringing water in the bucket, carrying small pieces of wood, stomping the clay with bare feet, laughing when splashes dirtied the hems of dresses or trousers. Ethan was always nearby, sometimes carrying logs, sometimes directing where it would be best to place a window to catch the breeze, sometimes bringing roof tiles in the wagon he got in an unlikely negotiation with a village merchant. Between one task and another, he talked with Mary about the future, about how life could be something other than just fleeing misfortune. He didn't promise her a fairy tale, but offered with constant presence the idea of true partnership, where shared pain turns into added strength. When the walls reached the right height and the roof began to be mounted, the community itself began to see concretely what was once just spoken courage. The news that the widow from the mill now had a piece of land in her name, and that there a school would be built, attracted curiosity and respect. Folks who used to cross themselves passing the basin now stopped a while, leaned on the fence, offered a day of help, a borrowed tool, a plate of food for the workers. Mary's transformation wasn't just of address. Her face, still marked by worry lines and the memory of pain, gained other contours. Her eyes remained firm, but now carried a new light, that of someone who no longer lives only on the defensive. Her body, used to the weight of cotton sacks and water buckets, now took pride in raising walls that wouldn't be taken down by anyone's order. Her posture before others changed. She stopped shrinking when the subject was an important decision, and started being called to opine on things that, before, only the boss or foreman resolved. Anne, a teenager now almost a young woman, found an unexpected path in the idea of the school, with the help of Mr. Arthur, who volunteered to teach her everything he knew of reading, writing, and arithmetic. She prepared herself, in determined silence, to become the first teacher of that space. She spent nights reading aloud to her siblings, practicing intonation, testing their patience with simple exercises of joining syllables. She dreamed, even without saying aloud, of the day when children from the whole countryside would sit on wooden benches before her to hear stories that weren't just of suffering. Jackie, who once had his arm squeezed for being accused of stealing oranges, now discovered the sensation of scratching his own name on a piece of paper without needing to ask anyone to recognize those letters for him. Tess, already stronger, coughing rarely after months of better feeding, ran through the yard of the new house drawing with a twig in the dirt, figures only she understood, but that somehow always resembled trees, rivers, and houses with big windows. The impact of Mary's choice went beyond the family. With the shed raised beside the future school, a wide space of beaten earth and simple roof, the community found a neutral place, belonging neither to the big house nor the store, where they could gather. On Sunday afternoons, after Mass, some stayed there to discuss practical things, planting bees, water division from the creek, help for someone who fell ill. Over time, that place also became a stage for small parties, sung prayers, improvised theatre rehearsals where children acted out stories of the region, including, in already softened versions, that of the child who cried in the field. Colonel Jackson, although maintaining his pose, couldn't ignore that something in his own position had changed. He remained the owner of the majority of the lands, continued being called Sir in many places, but his word no longer fell like an unquestionable sentence over all things. He began to walk a little less in the drying yards, leaving the task of giving direct orders more to the foreman. Some said he aged suddenly after that day at the mill. Others, more spiteful, whispered that the weight of his grandfather's history, read aloud, had finally settled for good on his shoulders. Years passed. Seasons succeeded one another, with droughts and floods, good harvests and bad, as is custom in any farming place. The school, which at the start was just a room of simple walls with rough benches, gradually gained the face of something established. An old cabinet brought from the village held notebooks, pieces of chalk, some books donated by people who hardly used them at home. The voices of children filled the space every morning, mixing the sound of spelled syllables with laughter and small squabbles. Anne, dressed in a dress always clean, even if worn, had become for many the lady of letters, the person they turned to when it was necessary to read a letter from afar or understand a government paper. Seeing the respect with which older adults treated her made Mary, from outside, sometimes let slip a proud smile, the kind that needs no word to explain itself. Ethan, faithful to the silent promise he made to himself, never really left. He continued running his drover routes, taking and bringing cattle and goods, but always returned to the mud house, now solid, where there was a place for his hat on the wall nail and a reserved plate on the wooden table. The relationship between him and Mary, built more on partnership than sudden passion, firmed up with time, like a tree root that grows slowly and for that very reason withstands more wind. Tess grew up running between the creek and the school, between the mill that was once haunted by legend and the yard now full of voices. For her, the story of the child crying in the field was almost an origin tale, something she heard from her mother's mouth in different versions, sometimes with more details, sometimes with more silence, but always ending with the same lesson, that no one was born to be thrown away as if they were worth nothing. On an autumn afternoon, many years after that first day Mary arrived at the mill with a handcart and 3 scared children, the scene in the basin was different. The sun went down slowly behind the hills, spreading a golden light over the cotton fields, which now shared space with small patches of corn, beans, and cassava of people who, inspired by her example, also began to fight for small pieces of ground. Near the creek, children wet their feet, laughing loudly, while others on the school porch repeated sentences Anne taught them to write. Mary was sitting in the shade of an inga tree, in front of the house she helped raise with her own hands. In her lap rested the same leather-bound notebook, now more worn at the edges, but still whole. The pages had been read so many times they almost seemed part of her skin. On that late afternoon, however, she no longer read with the urgency of before. She ran her fingers over Alphonse's slanted handwriting like someone caressing an old face, knowing that, although she couldn't change what he had done, she had managed, at least, to change what came after. Every now and then, some child approached asking her to tell, again, the story of the girl thrown in the field and the cry that woke the landowner. Mary would then take a deep breath, close the notebook, set it aside, and begin to narrate in a calm tone everything she knew, mixing what she lived with, what she inherited through others' handwriting. She didn't stage a ghost story. She spoke of choices, of fear, of courage, of people who err and try to fix it, of people who err and pretend they didn't see, of people who suffer but don't accept being defined only by that. As she told it, she looked at the attentive faces around her, saw there boys and girls from different families, children of sharecroppers, tenants, even one or another child of employees closer to the big house, all sitting on the same ground, breathing the same dust, hearing the same story. That, for her, was the true miracle, seeing that the pain of an almost erased childhood had transformed into the root of a place where other childhoods found space to exist more fully. When the night settled slowly over the basin, the wind returned to pass through the leaves of the cotton fields, producing that continuous sound that years ago so many people confused with a child's cry. Now, however, that same wind brought mixed in the sound of children's voices singing a song learned in school, the noise of conversation at the house door, the crackling of the wood stove preparing simple food, yet plentiful enough to keep away, at least that night, the ghost of hunger. In certain moments of silence, Mary allowed herself to remember the girl she had been, the emptiness of not knowing where she came from, the weight of always feeling on the margin of her own story. She thought about how, if the cry of that dawn hadn't been heard by anyone, perhaps she never would have lived to feel any of this. And if Alphonse's notebook had rotted under the boards, perhaps the land there would continue carrying only the memory of an unnamed injustice. In the end, what calmed her heart most was the certainty that that cry, which was born as a sign of abandonment, had transformed into a seed of change. Where before there was only the echo of despair, now there was laughter, letters scratched on a wooden board, meetings of simple people deciding together their own paths. The story that began with a child thrown in a field to be forgotten ended with a woman sitting on her own land, surrounded by voices, actively participating in the destiny of so many others. When she raised her eyes to the horizon, seeing the last thread of daylight vanish behind the hills, Mary liked to think that from somewhere, that girl in the poor cloth, left in the open, watched all this too. And in that thought, she found a phrase that, without having been written in any book, fit perfectly as the closure of an entire life. The cry that one day served to ask for help now echoed as a firm voice, spread in many mouths, proving that no life is condemned to be just a lost sound in the middle of the field.